Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar, The Missing Link in the Publishing Cycle. So in a few minutes I'll hand over to our presenter Vee Rogacheva. But first of all, I just want to go through a few housekeeping things with you. So first of all, we are recording this webinar, and a copy of the recording will be sent to you in an email after the webinar. Also, we would love to hear your questions, so please post those in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any problems during the webinar, if you could post those in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you now to our UX and service designer, Vee Rogacheva.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Jane. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today to talk about what we think is a missing link from the publishing cycle. So just two very brief slides for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with OpenAthens. We help over 2,600 organizations worldwide to access resources by providing a simple single sign-on solution for their users. We believe that accessing subscribe-based content should be fast, easy, and pain-free. No cursing forgotten passwords, just fast, easy access to the content you need. And we work to remove barriers to knowledge and help put information in the right hands. So you can understand this is just a little bit of a background of why we are putting together this presentation. It is in our mission to remove barriers to knowledge and to make accessing content as easy and as smooth as possible. And as part of that, as we are collaborating with both publishers and librarians, we analyze a lot in great detail the journey for users, but also the interaction between libraries and publishers as a whole information management community, and of course how researchers, what's the role of research and researchers in all of that. So today I'm going to share a couple of insights from our research, and I'm hoping we can start a conversation on the back of that and continue that beyond this webinar today. So I'm Vee Rogacheva. I am a user experience and service designer for OpenAthens. And this is a picture of me in one of my most terrifying experiences ever. I'm doing a usability test and research with 12-year-olds. I was left in a room with them by myself. I thought that was pretty scary. But the research showed us really interesting behavior that learners very early on exhibit when they interact with technology and when they use technology to learn and to research content. So we do this type of research all the time. We constantly observe and monitor changing patterns and trends in user behavior, and we share that with the community when possible. So talking about the hero of today, which is the publishing cycle, this is a version of it for those of you who haven't seen it or haven't really formally seen a kind of outline of a publishing cycle. This one is defined by the STM, which is an association of science, technology, and medicine publishers. Someone may correct me, I'm not really good with acronyms, but in essence, it is the association view of the publishing cycle. Now, in my experience, each individual publisher will have their own slightly different publishing cycle, but in any ways, they capture pretty much the same parts of a research and a researcher journey. So the definition of this one is research created by an author from a particular research community, passes through the journal editorial office of the author's chosen journal to its journal publisher, subscribing institutional libraries, before ending up back in the hands of the readers of that research community as a published paper in a journal. It is a bit of a mouthful. And when I've spent a long time looking at this description and this particular diagram, perhaps longer than it's reasonable for anyone to spend looking at the diagram. And I've actually presented this very same presentation to the STM annual conference in London, and I've asked the publishers presented on the day what do they think is the missing link in the publishing cycle. And a lot of different views came as a response to that question. So some suggest that there is no expression of the value exchange. That is completely unclear in this scenario. There's also issues whether there's questions whether this really captures the publishing cycle when we talk about open access publishing as well. So it's certainly not perfect. The STM Association themselves recognize that perhaps needs revisiting. They said that they haven't recently spent as much time looking at this particular diagram as perhaps I have. So there's definitely not one missing link. Let's put it that way. That there's a lot of things that are missing from this particular diagram, but also publishers may not be that good in recognizing them. Now, what I'm interested in is this last part of the definition, which is back in the hands of the readers. And this is what the next couple of slides will look to explore. Now, going back to this cycle itself, the purpose of it is to explore the relationship between the different parties involved, and that are the publishers, of course, but the libraries and the research community, or the researchers as well. And what struck me immediately is that there's quite a lot of things on the publisher side. It's perhaps a little bit top heavy. There's very little representation in the library, and the researcher community seems perhaps could be expanded as well. Of course, this is aimed at researchers publishing content or publishing research papers with a publisher, but we all know that learners are part of this landscape as well. So it's not just researchers, and arguably before they're researchers, they're learners. So that the research community is a bit broader, perhaps. Now, how does the user experience, as far as that part that I want to explore, which is the research kind of going back into the hands of the users. So how, in the back in the hands of the research community, so how does that look like? Now, a lot of, a very common way for this to happen as an interaction is individual users authenticating with username and password. So they go to a publisher's platform, get their username and password, and voila, here's the research. And that is the kind of the physical expression of that sentence, or those couple of words of how the research finds its way back into the research community hands. And a lot of publishing platforms are actually optimized for that kind of experience. They would invite individual subscriptions, individual users and their login experiences and access experiences, in many cases, cater exactly for that scenario. this particular example from JSTOR, in fact, they're optimizing for individuals downloading or buying that particular paper that they're interested in. You can see how prominent the download and subscribe buttons are here. So again, this is the thinking behind this is a one-to-one relationship when the researcher is going straight to the publisher and saying, give me access to that piece of research content. Here's another example from Elsevier, Science Direct. There's first most prominent sign-in option is targeted at individual users. Now, we know that not all users are individual users, and in fact, the majority of users are associated with an institution, a library, whether that's an educational library, public library, or a research library. There is an institution behind those users and researchers trying to access that content. And in a institutional access on-site scenario where the learners and researchers are on premise, ideally in the library, that's not, it works like magic. There is absolutely no need to sign in because there is an IP authentication working on the background. So accessing content is really straightforward, and perhaps that reinforces the thinking behind publishers prioritizing direct and individual users in their platforms rather than institutional users, because IP authentication just instantly knows where the user is physically and grants access based on that. So this is an example of a IP address that perhaps most of you are familiar with. It reminds me of a telephone number. It's difficult perhaps to memorize, but it's not that you could do it if you wanted to. Now there's a slight problem with those, and that is that they are running out, as in there are no more. We've run out of all the numbers in the world. They are assigned to servers, and they cannot be moved, they cannot be exchanged, and certainly there's no more of them out there available. So the next thing is this. So this is the new format. It's called IPv6, for those of you who've seen this before. This is the new IP format, which is increasingly being used elsewhere, but not so much in the information management community. But soon, as I said, we are running out of IPs, so we will have to deal with this kind of IP addresses. And IP authentication then that introduces an extra layer of complexity into that scenario of IP authentication. Not to mention that currently publishers are not geared, their platforms are not geared to deal with this kind of IP format. If someone out there their platform is able technically to handle IPv6, please let me know. I'll be curious to learn about technical implementation, but as far as I know, that is not the case at the moment. So even if a library adopts this new format, there is no publisher out there that can grant them access based on this IP address. There's another issue with IP addresses, and according to the IP registry, 58% of IP ranges held by publishers to authenticate libraries are inaccurate. So actually almost 60% of what we use as a key to enter into the world of academic research is the wrong key. So users may be accessing a completely wrong content. We don't know, or not accessing a content which is not being able to, even though they're using the right, they are at the premise of the library. It may be that the publisher doesn't have the correct IP address that will prevent access. regardless that the user has actually done the hard work to go to the physical library and try and research, do their research there. There are a couple of other issues with IP authentication, which perhaps are more prevalent when we're talking about offsite access. So when the researchers are physically present on site, that's straightforward. As I said, it works as if by magic, and the paywall is invisible. It's just not there. They have straight access into the publishers' platforms. However, when they're offsite, working remotely for whatever reason, that paywall is now there, and they have to find a way to get access or overcome the paywall, unless they want to pay the $15 to download that particular research. They need to authenticate themselves as a researcher coming from a subscribing institution. So what is the most kind of common solution in that particular case is a proxy server used by the library. So in that case, the libraries develop their own proxy servers that handle offsite cases. So what in effect this does is it recognizes the user, and then it pretends that the user is in the library, or makes it so that it seems that the user is still in the library, whereas in fact the user can be anywhere. They can be in the cafe down the road, at home, or on the other side of the world. It doesn't really matter. What the proxy does is it rewrites the link to make it look like it's coming from the on-premise library. This is all managed by the library. The investment to put this together is done by the library. There are, in many cases, there are people who deal just with the proxy server. Some libraries have dedicated technical librarians dealing just with that. Other smaller libraries would have IT teams helping with the proxy server, or in some cases they would outsource that service. There are solutions out there that are available and can provide such service. Now, in this case, as I mentioned, there are some issues here, and this particularly when we talk about security. So what that proxy does is it acts as a man-in-the-middle attack, and it can be used as a man-in-the-middle attack. And the problem is not so much for the librarians and the library, it is more so for the publisher, because using this method, it's not difficult to enter, to overcome the paywall, even though you are not associated with that institution. It is not difficult to spoof those proxy servers and get access to the content. Now, the user, there's another problem with the proxy and the proxy resource, the proxy being in place as the only method of authentication on the publisher side. And that is that users need to click on specific links. They need to trigger that proxy server to rewrite the request so they can be recognized. And this is only possible if their journey or their research starts at the library portal. So if there's a university library, as the example on the page, there's library portal. Usually users will be asked to authenticate once they get there, and then they can click those magic links and get in. That's absolutely no problem. And in this scenario, remote access works just fine. The problem with this is that users don't always use the library portal. In fact, the most popular discovery tool is Google Scholar. And it is by small margin, it's not a dramatic difference, but in any case, the user preference is to use Google. During research, we also see that some users prefer to go directly to publishers' site, and they also use alternative forms of content that may or may not require authentication. Now, in all of those three other scenarios, Proxy doesn't work. It just doesn't work. There is no magic link for the user to click. If they find an article using Google Scholar and that article lives on a publishing platform that only supports IP authentication, that's a dead end for them. They cannot overcome that paywall. So what a lot of researchers, experienced, seasoned researchers do is they use Google Scholar to find the article, then they go back to the library portal and they try to access it that way if their library subscribes to that particular content. Of course, you can appreciate that's not an ideal research and its own research journey, and it's not available option for everybody. This is only for researchers that are quite skilled in understanding the technologies and have experience doing research online. Now, the alternative to Proxy is something called SAMO. I'm not going to go into too much technical detail here. I'm happy to answer questions about it to the best of my abilities at the end. But the way that SAMO works is it introduces a military-grade secure exchange that validates. There's a three-way validation between the individual researcher, the publisher, and the institution. And in that exchange, it is guaranteed that the individual trying to access the content is the individual associated with that institution and has the right to a valid claim to access that content. That whole process happens in milliseconds. So the users really, there is not much delay there. They are asked to enter their institutional credentials when they try to access, for example, Science Direct. They'll be redirected to enter their institutional credentials and then redirected back to the content. So it really takes just a couple of seconds for this exchange to happen. But that is a way for the researcher to get into Science Direct without hitting the library platform at all. This method of authentication is recommended by RA21 initiative, which is now known as Coalition for Seamless Access, or no, it's seamlessaccess.org. And there is a NISO recommendation that explores this way of authentication in detail for those who are interested. It assumes that both the library and the publisher will do some kind of technical upgrading in order to enable this method. Whereas in the Proxy scenario, it's just the library that does the investment. In this scenario, it's both ends. So publishers need to update their platforms, libraries need to enable SAMO on their end. Now, going back to the user journey, as I said, SAMO enables those alternative ways of accessing content. So it's not just the library portal. Users can gain access using any other method. Again, the caveat here is that both the library and the publisher has it. So if the library has only Proxy, but the publisher offers SAMO, it will not work. If it's the other way around, it won't work. So it has to be on both ends. That's the caveat. So with so many reasons why IP is perhaps not optimal, why it's so popular. So the disadvantages of IP and Proxy, as I mentioned, it's unsecure, sometimes it's unstable, it's prone to error, also requires a specialized resource on the library side. So there's Proxy specialists that write these Proxy stanzas and maintain that record. over time. And within that, which is more or less a manual work, that's where error may occur. And again, it assumes that the user journey starts at the library portal. However, if you go back to the publishing cycle, you can see something I've mentioned already. The investment of IP access is on the library side. The publishers are literally not involved in that. They just say, yeah, give me your IP, and poof, off you go. You have access. And I guess there are. This is a reflection of a legacy way to access content. Historically, when perhaps printing was more prevalent, you would go to the library to access content. So when digital was suddenly available, the assumption was that the pattern won't change. The users will still go to the library in order to access content. So IP was what was available at the time and widely used for that particular scenario. So that's what was adopted, and the library assumed the cost of it and has been carrying the cost ever since. Again, if in a SAMO authentication model, the investment needs to be shared, there is a investment cost on the publisher side. They need to upgrade their platforms to enable that technology. For both publishers and libraries, these are one-off costs. It's not a running cost in a way. I mean, there is certain maintenance on the publisher side, but it's not that every library and every publisher need to do work every time. It is mostly done once, but in any case, this introduces a need to invest on the publisher side as well. Another thing that I've looked at, looking at the publishing cycle and access, was the way that within the publishing cycle, we measure success and how access impacts that. So for libraries, often that is number of downloads, which comes from counter reports. They've analyzed this as a measure of success and how good a resource is in terms of adoption from their library patrons. For researchers, however, there are a number of measures, but a kind of a popular one is number of citations, which is different than downloads. Oops. And for publishers, they measure everything and they have visibility of everything. But ultimately, what they're interested in is number of subscriptions. So how many libraries subscribe to their platforms. And you can tell already those are not aligned. And if we're talking about a cycle, so going through that cycle, if those measurements are not aligned and there isn't a common understanding of what those measurements entail, that has certain negative implications along the way. How access impacts measurements of success. So for libraries, a decrease in number of downloads. You can have a poor access may increase the number of user complaints they see. They will need to invest in troubleshooting resources. I've met quite a few librarians who are really struggling to keep on top of troubleshooting their resources, and that dominates their daily life as librarians. There's disengagement with the library if access is problematic, that patrons just find resource somewhere else and stop engagement with the library altogether. And of course, there's budget pressure. With a lower number of downloads, there's more pressure on the library to cut spending. For a number of citations, for researchers, problematic access actually hinders a number of citations. So that their research funding may depend on that, and may depend on the choices they make when they choose which journal to publish with. Who and how are able to access that content can have an implications for the number of citations they potentially can get, or the impact of that particular research. And for publishers, poor access impacts number of subscriptions, even though perhaps the impact is not so straightforward. That certainly increases the pressure during negotiation with library. They may lose, some smaller publishers literally lose customers. And of course, they're just exposed to piracy, making their content available for free in alternative sources. And that, of course, just defeats the purpose of trying to sell it in effect. So if we look at how by improving access, how we could disrupt the landscape and disrupt that publishing cycle, there's a couple of examples. I just want to draw a comparison from different industries. And here I'm pointing to some obvious examples, and I'm not suggesting this is the way forward for publishing. But we have to appreciate that music content, for example, is not very far from any content, publishing content, or a piece of research data, database, archive repository. It's still content that is protected and copyrighted in some ways. So for the music industry, you go to a concert, you are physically present. You have an experience, you listen to the music. If you want to listen to music anytime, anywhere, there's a couple of solutions out there available. It's super easy. The user just go search for the song or the album or the artist and explores a whole library of music content. The film industry, exactly the same scenario. If you want to see a film, you go to the cinema, you see that specific one film. You have some popcorn maybe. If you watch movies anytime, anywhere, there's all sorts of options available to you. You don't have to watch a video to have access to a film content. You don't have to be confined to the cinema. The cinema offers more than just watching a movie. How about the publishing industry? So if we draw the same parallel, if going to the library is the default option, or kind of the limited option, what is there to do research anytime, anywhere? And there isn't a single answer at the moment, but there are a couple of alternative options that users are already exploring. So researchers and learners are already exploring. So the first one is not Sci-Hub, for those of you who would expect me to say that. Apparently it's ResearchGate. This is a tweet from last year, December last year, measuring outgoing on-campus traffic. And the top result there is actually ResearchGate. For those of you who are not familiar, ResearchGate is a researcher platform / social media / collaborative tool. It is a platform for researchers. Allegedly has more than, I'll get the number, got millions of users. It is extremely popular. A lot of publishers, the big publishers, are paying really close attention to ResearchGate. ProQuest are collaborating with them, and there's other initiatives for collaboration with ResearchGate. They are free. It's a free platform, and it allows researchers to access drafts of published research and collaborate before the research is published or after it's published. There is a bit of a copyright gray area with ResearchGate, but in any case, it is an extremely popular tool. Another very popular alternative is open access. Actually, it's right there available. There's no paywall. And this particular study I came across from Pivovar suggests that papers that are hidden behind paywall are cited 10% less than the world average. So there's a tangible impact on that citation number of citations that researchers are after. So their decision to publish on open access or paywall may have an impact on the number of citations they get. Now, a lot of people dispute these findings, mainly publishers. I'm sorry, my dear colleagues and friends from the publishing industry, but there's a good number of other studies that find similar results about open access content. And in any case, during usability studies, when I work with learners and researchers, the bias towards open access content is really obvious, particularly with those researchers that are perhaps early on in their research career, that are a bit more inexperienced. It's really easy for them to just access open access content. So how might we improve the publishing cycle? So including access as part of it, I think it will recognize how important that is and how much of an impact it has on the entire cycle, and the ability of the parties involved to benefit from the publishing cycle. It really hinders on good, easy, simple, straightforward access to that precious research content. So if we did include access, we'll be able to capture and represent the experience of the researchers and the learners better. It will invite and open the door to innovate and perhaps consider different ways of doing things within the publishing cycle and within the wider industry. It will improve decision making. It will help publishers to prioritize improved user experience and improved access when they're making investments in their platforms. So, and what's the role of the library in this? I think the librarians will really have an important role as an advocate and the voice of the learners and the researchers, but they have the responsibility to work with their patrons, study their behaviors, understand their expectations, and then pass that on to publishers, exercise that bargaining power that those high numbers of patrons that you have behind you, exercise that bargaining power during your conversations with publishers, and make ease of access part of your negotiations. Also, discuss with your researchers when research librarians are working with researchers, discuss with their options with them and the importance of ease of access to the impact of their potential impact of their research. Until then, unfortunately, I think access remains the missing link on the publishing cycle. And I truly believe that it is only by collaboration within the information management industry that we can bridge that gap, and we can address not only the access, the access as a missing link, but other issues with the publishing cycle. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions or comments. Anyone agreeing or disagreeing, all feedback is welcome.
Thank you, Vee, for a very thought-provoking presentation. So we do have a few questions. So the first one is, what changes would you make as either a publisher or library to close the gap in the open access experience for researchers?
Really good question. Thank you very much for that. As my research certainly suggests that open access actually has an advantage. It kind of, it's in the title, and we have to appreciate that patrons don't think about content in those terms. They don't think about content as open access and other. They just look for information, and if there is no barrier to it, then that's immediately on top of their list. So it's not easy to level the playing field, but you can certainly, both as libraries and publishers, try and minimize the impact of that pay wall, of that pay barrier as much as possible. So the seamless it is, the better. I can't hear you, Jane.
Sorry. A second question is, are the libraries and publishers the best place for filling this gap, or is the private open source market a better alternative?
Interesting question. I don't have the answer for that. As I said, I think it is really, the answer is in collaboration, and all parties involved collaborating closer together to find the right solutions. Now, OpenAthens is kind of in the private sector, even though we are non-for-profit, collaborating with education institutions for 25 years this year. There are other providers out there that have solutions that make the user journey and user experience better. Certainly look for those. Or if you want to know more about how OpenAthens can help, please reach out, and we're happy to explore further.
Sorry, muted again. A third question, given the trends and developments you've mentioned, how likely do you think it is that publishers and libraries retain their centrality to the publishing cycle in the coming decades? And the comment is that it appears to the participant that, referring back to the diagram, that we see the circular part of your workflow diagram increasing and libraries and publishers falling further out of favour.
Yes, good question, and it's a really good comment. I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately. I don't know how things will play out, but I can certainly see a risk of further disengagement of learners and researchers from both libraries and publishers. So it really, we need to act now as a community. Just kicking the ball down the road, I think it's just going to make things worse until the Spotify of publishing appears, and then it will all be solved by the new Steve Jobs of publishing. But until then, I think we just have to work together to make the landscape better.
Thank you, Vee. And just a comment from one of the participants that says that Emerald Publishing grant access via IPv6. So maybe worth a conversation with them.
We'll definitely have a chat with them. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really interested to know how they've implemented that. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the tip. I will follow up with them.
Great, and that concludes all the questions. So there's just a few other things that we want to run through, but thank you very much, Vee, for a really brilliant presentation. So if you could move on to the next slide. I just want to ask everyone who's joined us today if you take a couple of minutes just to complete our short survey, just to let us know what you thought about the webinar and any future topics that you might be interested in. So there's a bit.ly link there. Also, there's more information on Vee's blog, so do have a look at that and have a look through the content there. Oh, sorry, move back one. Oh, sorry, yes. Our next webinar is on the 20th of February, so that's next Thursday, where you can hear about 3 of the finalists, the publishing finalists that have taken part in our Best Publisher UX Award. And so you'll get to hear from Bloomsbury, Cambridge University Press and Emerald. So please do join us and sign up for that webinar. If you're not able to join at that date and time, we'll send you a recording link if you register for the webinar. And finally, you can meet Vee in person at our Access Lab conference, which is on the 19th of March in London. So do come along, and we will also be announcing the winner of our Best Publisher UX Award at the conference. We've got a brilliant program. It includes things like privacy, personalization, and simplifying the user experience. So please do come along to that. And that concludes the webinar. So again, thank you very much, Vee, and we will be dropping you all a line with all of these links and the video recording. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact Vee using the email address just there, or you can contact us at contact@openathens.net. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thanks, everybody.